It's a great pleasure to welcome you, Laurie, to the Centre for Computing History here in Cambridge. But please tell us who you are and what you do.
I'm Laurie van Someren. Before I left the USA, we had in the laboratory at Electron a Wang office computer. Fairly complicated, programmable using punch cards. I was a voluntary treasurer of a local organization, and it was very useful for doing the accounts when I was the treasurer. But that was an out-of-work hours activity. I was aware of them. A friend of mine worked for Wang for quite a while, but they had no impact on me personally. And in the 1970s, I think it is true to say that they had no impact on me personally. Mm-hmm. Because they hadn't penetrated enough. And if we went to one of your posters about decades and their computer significance, we could check that point. But really, I didn't get into computing until the 1980s. And then I got into it because of my sons. So that is a discontinuity in our narrative, if you like.
Well, you've come back to the UK now.
Yeah.
You've got a young family.
Yeah.
You're setting up your business. It's going along, and as you say, your sons are now maturing and growing up. So, what were the encouragements and the directions that they were then going in?
Well, here again, there are two very significant factors. One is that, as Alex has subsequently said, within the last decade, I think, when he answered the phone at home, he didn't say, "Hi, this is Alex," like he does now. He said, "Aleph One, can I help you?" Aleph One being the name of my company. So they grew up in an entrepreneurial environment where I was working from home, as I had done ever since 1971, and had me as a role model. And I had role models from Massachusetts, which were profoundly significant to me. And Nico, who was 2 years younger, had the same role model and an example of a home-work crossover, if you like, which makes a superb balance, actually. The other thread is that we were fortunate to be able to send them both to King's College School in Cambridge, which then, as now, is absolutely superb. And subsequently, I've asked both Alex and Nico separately which was the most important educational institution they went to. And they both say King's College School. And if you go back and check up on it now, it is just as good as it ever was, and probably better. It's brilliant. Now, the effect of that was very good for their secondary education. But a byproduct of that, we can come back to secondary education later if you choose, a byproduct of that was that they would, if they had to catch the bus home to Bottisham, go through Cambridge, walk down Emmanuel Street, stop and go downstairs in the basement of Cambridge Computer Shop and see what was new. And when the first Macintosh came out, they were absolutely impassioned about it. And I think I see one glinting over there. And they had their toe into computing very, very early on. And I guess it must have been by the end of the 70s that there's a fuzzy bit here I'm not quite clear of the details of, but by the end of the 70s they were hanging out with Herman Hauser and Chris Curry at Acorn Computers, which then was on the marketplace in Cambridge, in the centre of Cambridge. And Chris and Herman were doing their things and coming up with the BBC Micro, but there were preceding computers, the Atom and another one whose name escapes me. And Acorn was therefore exhibiting these at exhibitions in London and around the place. And Alex and Nico hung around Acorn and the exhibitions so much that it reached a point where the guys on the stand would say, "Okay, we're going off for an hour now for lunch. Can you guys mind the stand?" And they did. And they're both rather articulate and knew the material intimately. And so when Alex left school, and this is some time later, he left school on a Friday afternoon and went to work for Acorn on Monday morning without messing around going to university or anything like that. Nico's career was more conventional. But it was not until 1982 that essentially they dragged me into computing as a result of work they did on debugging the operating system for the BBC Micro. They were each given a BBC Micro when they first appeared in spring 1982. I remember this particularly clearly because there was a huge waiting list of people who knew what the BBC Micro was. They were on the telly, weren't they? And I went to an exhibition of psychological equipment, biofeedback particularly, at the British Psychological Meeting at the University of York. And I had a BBC Micro with me, which I'd hooked up to a relaxometer measuring arousal, so that it would record on chart recorder a trace which moved up and down as you became more relaxed. And this was interesting to the psychologists, but very quickly technicians from all over the campus at York were coming and saying, "You've got a BBC Micro, how did you get that? We've been on the waiting list for 6 months, I'm sure we paid them for it." And here I was with the BBC Micro tucked under my arm. So they pulled me sideways into computing. Now that was 82. I don't think in the 70s I really had anything to do with computing, but they certainly did. And so the felicitous bits of that were the chance of being at a good school in Cambridge, going past the Cambridge Computer Store, having a father who was an entrepreneur. And they built on those in their subsequent careers.
We'll return to the sons later, and obviously their careers. But now you're introduced to computing. You're starting to use the Acorn computer. Has it now become an indispensable part of what you do during your future entrepreneurship?
Acorn quit the computer business in 1999, rather abruptly. We had been deeply involved in doing stuff with Acorn computers through the 80s, later 80s and 90s, and there is a lot to say about that. But Acorn computers now play absolutely no part in my life except when I come to the Computing History Museum, because they are no longer commercially significant for anybody at all, having quit, as I said. Yeah.
So what did you shift over to?
Well, it will make more sense to talk about what we did in the 90s, because we sold things to go into Acorn machines. The commercially most significant one of these was a PC card which plugged into the brilliantly designed expansion port on an Acorn machine and allowed you to put a PC processor, a 386 processor, on the card and feed its output back into and through the Acorn machine and out onto the screen. So you could run Windows, DOS first of all, but then Windows, on an Acorn machine in a window. So that was quite a coup. Now this was 91 that came out.
Was this something you developed then?
Well, there was a number of people involved. Before that, Alex had spotted through his proximity to Acorn and continuing work for them, mainly as a consultant, but also as a teacher in the Acorn Training Center, had spotted an opportunity for the ARM processors. Acorn made a leap from 8-bit computers, first of all, to 32-bit computers. And the 32-bit ones, I think, were all called Archimedes. I'm not quite sure on that point. It's easy to verify. Anyway, in the early 32-bit, let's call them Archimedes computers that Acorn produced, the CPU was in a socket. That in those days, they had tentacles all around the edge, and they were soldered down. You could see the solder joint and inspect it. You can't do that anymore. But because it was socketed in the ones that they were selling, they were looking ahead, and Alex spotted that the next generation Acorn computer was going to use an ARM3 processor in place of the ARM2 processor. That was not a huge technological leap forward. It had very much the same reduced instruction set of commands that the previous one had, but it did have a significant increase in the size of the cache on the chip, and that had a very significant difference on the performance, a huge difference. And so we saw that if we took apart one of our Acorn computers and took the CPU out, we could put in a supplementary board which would fit in that socket, but would be larger, would have its own clock. It could get its power from the socket, and it would run with this significantly increased performance. And it needed a little bit of software, and so Nico dashed off a little bit of software, and Acorn paid £150 for that little bit of software, and we got the right to use it along with anybody else who wanted it. And so we shipped a disk of software and a PCB with a plug on the bottom which fit into the Archimedes. And the demand for them was enormous, and they cost £600. And in the 80s, no, 90s, this was an enormous amount of money. But they sold incredibly well. Now, they were not cheap to make, but we had a decent profit margin, and we could sell through distributors, which is not something Aleph One had done before. But they were clearly necessary because there was, even then, a very big eco-structure around Acorn of people supplying the Acorn market.
So can I can actually bring you to that then? So you spot an opportunity and of something that can be developed. How did you go about the financing and getting that produced? Because there is an initial upfront cost in terms of trying to get something going.
Well, okay, the board layout was done by a guy who Alex had worked with on networking Acorn computers, and who'd started Atom-wide, another computer networking firm. His last name, Martin Coulson, his name is. And he did the PCB layout, and he did the wiring, as it were, to a spec that must have been hammered out by Alex and Nico, and maybe people inside Acorn. I don't know. But
so was this paid work, or was it something?
No. This was an Aleph One project,
right? And
Acorn was happy to have us use the chips because they were selling the chips. And there's a little digression there, which is interesting, which we can come back to. So we were buying in chips. They needed an I/O manager chip, so we had to buy that too. We mounted them on a board, which Martin Coulson designed. Ian Harvey, who was a brilliant software engineer, and who also comes into the story again later, had a key role in figuring out how to get the graphic output of a PC through a machine with an utterly different operating system and onto the screen. Three companies could see this need arising. It arose partly because there was an urge to get Acorn computers into schools. Schools required that they be able to run DOS and Windows software. And so two other companies said they would do this. By the time of next year's Acorn World show, they said, we were the only one that actually did. And it appeared in spring 1991. And that became commercially very significant and was sold through distributors too. So there were intersecting networks in play there. One was the network of people around Cambridge and computing, which Alex and Nico were well hooked into. One was the Acorn ecostructure, which wasn't called an ecostructure because the term hadn't been coined in high tech then. But that's what it was. And a lot of people knew a lot of other people and knew what they were good at. I had my devices, my biofeedback instruments had been manufactured by a guy who I'd known since teenage years, who ran an electronic manufacturing company in Hadley. And there's another story behind that, but let's not go into it right now. So we didn't find it at all difficult to organize and do the production. And it was entirely self-funded. ARM3 processors had been selling well. Aleph One has never had an overdraft, except for a very short period when Acorn said, okay, we want 35,000 of these and we want you to build them for us, get cracking. And that needed outside funding, but we had the order and we were able to persuade the manager of the Midland Bank, whom I'd been dealing with for 20 years or something, that we were a fair bet. So we got a short-term, we got an overdraft facility and we paid it off fairly quickly because Acorn paid us adequately quickly.
That's brilliant. I'll stop you there because I just want to make sure where you want to go next. What are the thoughts that we've...
Can you remember the person in the bank who you dealt with? Was it a local bank you were dealing with?
The bank manager?
Midland, his name was Thompson, and he had a very good reputation which lingered after Midland was swallowed by HSBC. He retired not long after that swallowing occurred. I don't know his first name. I always suggest him as Mr. Thompson, I think. One did in those days.
So it's interesting, Laurie, you were already alluding to the fact that when certain issues or problems arose and a solution could be seen, there was an existence of a network of people who would get together or who you would talk to. So can you tell us a bit more about the network at the time, how people got together and who was approached?
It was very informal. Pubs were important in it. The pub element lingered. It may still linger. The Panton Arms on Panton Street was the haunt of the Linux-oriented group within Cambridge. And it was therefore a haunt of other people who, like computers, talked about them, maybe freelanced on Saturdays and in the evenings for computer companies solving particular technical problems, and knew who to ask if they got stuck. And this is where the networking effect really comes into play. So the Panton Arms was one of the sites where I know this was taking place. I wasn't there, but I remember a guy on that street who had a line printer in his basement and was doing very high volume printing for people around Cambridge in his basement. That was a little entrepreneurial activity. If you wanted multiple copies of a very long document, you went to him, and chain printers were mind-blowingly fast.
Well, coming back to Aleph One, though, when you were producing the new boards that you were producing in Acorn, so, what were the dynamics then of who got in touch with who, and you brought in to that as part of the network that we had at the time?
You know, I don't remember. It's the sort of thing that simply happened. Alex and Nico and I were well connected in slightly different ways, in slightly different parts of the network. The loose network of business and computer connected people in Cambridge.
Was it a fairly closed clique then, or a group of people interested in that area?
It was a random group who would associate if they happened to be around and feel like going out that evening. It was, I'm sure, as loose as that. That is a question that Alex could probably answer, and at some point, this is one you will want to raise with him. At this point, Alex was living in Cambridge, I think. Well, over much of this period, he was living in Cambridge. Let's see, no, because he didn't. He was living in London most of the 80s. His daughter Venice was born in London in 1990. After that, they moved to Cambridge, to Sturton Street. So he was around in Cambridge in the 90s and present quite a bit in the 80s. He would come out and stay with us in Bodisham overnight and go into work at Acorn in the morning. Newmarket Road, it was easy. So they just knew people. Things kind of, it was very easy to figure out which way to turn next. If you didn't know somebody, you knew somebody who did know where to turn. It was that kind of network.
People have talked about the 6 degrees of separation.
Yeah.
So what's your feeling about that within the Cambridge area?
It is only recently that the nature of the Cambridge network, in its loose social sense, not the organisation, has been articulated quantitatively by somebody who said, you know about the 6 degrees of freedom, anybody in the world can connect to anybody in the world within no greater than 6 steps. He said, in Cambridge there are only 2 steps. If you have a problem and you find somebody you think might know somebody, they will know somebody who does know the answer. It is not 6 steps, it's only 2 steps. I think the 2 degrees of separation that was articulated recently is true now.
So how does that work in Cambridge then?
I'm not part of it any longer because I've been saying for some years I'm trying to retire. It's not been a complete success, but I don't go out in the evenings to meetings as much as I used to. I really don't know the fine detail. Now, when Alex and Nico and Martin Coulson invested in the company called Acorn Archimedes, it had offices in Cambridge on Newmarket Road, not the section between the big roundabout and Maid's Causeway. It's probably not called Newmarket Road. An office building there. And so they had 10 people working there. And they would have been part of this network of Cambridge connections. And one of them was Ian Harvey, who, as I say, has figured in several points along this long chain that we're talking about.
But eventually, from these loose sort of social connections that existed at the time, structures began to emerge. And I believe Chase is one. Can you tell us about that, please?
Well, okay. In 1988, John Harris and I and another guy whose name I shall remember soon, who lived in Fulbourn, got together. There had been organizations trying to bridge this gap between entrepreneurial activity and larger and more dynamic businesses. At least one of them had been government funded, and it had an office, Cambridge Cooperative Development Centre, corner of Lensfield Road and Waterside, and a man in charge who was not very effective. And John and I went to a couple of meetings and didn't learn anything. And so John and I and this third man said we'd try and pull some people together. And we had a meeting at Bodisham Village College because we could get there easily, and invited some other people and said there was a Cambridge Small Business Club, but it was, funnily enough, the meetings I went to were largely populated by retailers, which wasn't what I was interested in, but there they were. John Harrison and I decided we would pull some people together, and we nucleated Chase in 1988.
So what does Chase stand for?
Chase stands for the Cambridge High-Tech Association of Small Enterprises, always abbreviated to Chase, and it's still running. It's always been run by volunteers. And for a while in the early days, it had a committee and it had committee meetings and infrastructure like that. It is now run by 3 volunteers and has trouble finding speakers. I think its years may be numbered, but it did evidently fill a useful function. And indeed, it had a very interesting side effect. In 1992, we ran a conference at the Welding Institute, the conference centre there. It's got another name now, called Where Angels Dare and VCs Also Tread. And it was about angels and VCs spanning this gap. The timing was absolutely superb, and we got 120 people who paid something, a few £100 each. And we got a bunch of good speakers, and we organized it as a series of 2 or 3 speakers around a theme, and then breakout groups of 10 around circular tables, and then a rapporteur reporting back to the collective, the plenary session. And it really held people's attention, and people didn't leave before the end, and indeed they didn't leave 2 hours after the end. I remember clearly because I was in the cleanup team. It was a really great success, and that was Chase's most successful event. Now, otherwise, it used to do regular weekly, monthly meetings, not weekly. We ran them on First Tuesdays until First Tuesday started up in London, which was trying to do exactly the same thing in cribbed down name, and we didn't want to compete, so we moved to Mondays. That allowed people to go to London One if they wanted to.
So what sort of subjects would you have been covering?
A very wide range. We've always been interested in getting speakers who talk about the development of their companies and how they got to be where they are in very much the way that I'm doing now. But there were also occasions when we picked up on smaller, simpler themes, and I remember once doing a presentation on how to get paid, which related to my experiences with Acorn and some other Acorn subcontractors. Acorn were rather slow in paying us once, and I discovered, I think Acorn cited Aleph One as a reference to a new refuse removal company. And the refuse removal company therefore picked up the reference, as a good company should, and wrote to me saying, what's it like working with Acorn? And I said, if you have something to supply that they really want, they'll pay you, but don't assume that they'll do, otherwise they'll do it in less than 30 days. There's nobody around except perhaps Herman who could possibly remember that, so I'm not slandering anybody by reporting it now, I hope.
So the topics that Chase was concerned with were really on the entrepreneurship side.
Yes, small enterprises. We did think about excluding companies of more than 5 people when we started, but it didn't prove to be necessary. People with a larger company background did not feel the sense of isolation that did and probably still does characterize entrepreneurs who spin out on their own or with one other guy and lack that background that they had. And so Chase definitely filled a need there. It does provide useful networking opportunities still, and it's still running, and it gets sponsorship from Mills and Reeve and from Arm, who alternate in providing a venue for Chase meetings on the first Monday of each month. And are very much valued for their contributions.
So, I mean, in a sense, you've been a small serial entrepreneur who's grown businesses out of these things. So you've seen the progression. Now, within the Cambridge environment, how do you see entrepreneurial companies developing, especially sort of on the technology, on the computing side? What's the route as it used to be and as it is now? What do you think it is?
There are drastic differences. Aleph One has always been self-funded, as I say. It's become much more formalized. The characterization of business angels and of venture capitalists has become sharper. And that is the result of an evolutionary process which heavily involved, I think, Nigel Brown and the Great Eastern Investment Forum. That ran for a number of years in Cambridge and really was a very significant agency in providing entrepreneurs an opportunity to meet business angels and make a presentation and then talk to them afterwards if they wanted to. And it was well organized. You paid a fee to join GEIF, and you paid another fee if you were going to make a presentation. N.W. Brown was interested in it because they knew a lot of people who had a lot of money. They were an intermediary, and it was well run, and I went to a lot of their meetings, and I met a lot of interesting people there, including a lot that were doing far out things that I admired, but couldn't possibly imagine getting involved in. But yeah, it was a fertile ground, and it was a step along the route to a higher degree of formalization. And so now the process is more likely to involve business angels if you have a hook into Cambridge Angels somehow, or have some other contact in the angel network, and you may or may not be sufficiently highly evolved to go to places like Herman's present operation, the Amadeus Capital Partners, but that's a 7-figure and 8-figure sum organization, so it doesn't really address entrepreneurs. This might be evolution in Herman's function over the years. And Alex, I should say, is now working for him with a special responsibility for high-tech companies. Not all of them around Cambridge, indeed some of them outside the country. So he has evolved in a way that is matching Herman's here. They've known each other since Alex was 15, which makes it easy for them to get along. And Alex enjoys working with him. But he's now formalization. Amadeus Capital Partners have another office in London. They have alternate weeks. They have a meeting of all the partners in either London or Cambridge. And so Alex is now dashing around on their behalf as an intermediary at a higher level. And it's clearly very necessary. They're keeping very busy. They're raising money and investing it and getting returns. So the whole process has got more formalized, and I have dropped out of it without any pangs, but with an awareness of what's still going on.
So if we wander back to the 80s and the 90s, then when you were developing products that could feed into the Acorn system and subsequent computers, what do you think was the role of Cambridge within the wider technology environment relating to computing at that time?
Because of Cambridge Computer Laboratory, there was the Cambridge phenomenon, which was mapped out in that glorious concentric circles chart, in which the Cambridge Computer Laboratory was only one of the roots of the branching process. Are you aware of that chart?
No.
Well, it's important. 1983, Siegel, Quince, Wicksteed were commissioned to do a report on the Cambridge business environment. They didn't say high-tech because it was not limited to high-tech, it included biotech, which has become very, very significant since. There are more billion-dollar companies in biotech than there are in high-tech in Cambridge. But the outcome of that was the Cambridge phenomenon original report, which plotted the descent of companies from roots, of which Cambridge Computer Lab was one. Cambridge Scientific Instruments was another, which has its roots in Pi, and before that, Pi Instrument Company, which was making instruments at the beginning of the 20th century for the Cavendish Laboratory and scientists there. And I bet if you go on a tour of the Cavendish, you'll see glassware that was made by Cambridge Instrument Company. Very deep roots. More and more technological as time went on. Enormous expansion into radio equipment, transmitting and receiving equipment, bought by Philips, and has now disappeared from the face of Cambridge. But it was a route from which this branching took place. I don't remember the diagram well, and when I last looked for my copy, I couldn't find it, which irritated me. But it was all mapped out in the late 80s, I think.
One of the other aspects that we're interested in is Britain has always been famed for having its inventions and then somebody actually taking the intellectual property rights to it and exploiting it elsewhere. What was the situation with Aleph One and your relationship with the different computing companies in terms of, did you protect your property?
No, we didn't. Part of the reason for that is clear from my description of the way 3 companies said they would do PC cards for Acorn computers, and only one of them did.
So it was market leadership.
The protection lay in the know-how, and once we'd done that, there was no point in anybody else trying to copy PC cards for Acorn computers. For one thing, the Acorn market was nothing like the size of PC markets as we now understand them. And Microsoft, it must be given the credit for getting PCs into every household. So we were tagging on one little corner on one edge of that space with what we did. So we most of the things we've done haven't been of the magnitude that would justify spending with IP lawyers. The only exception to that, which just shows that I'm not against the idea in principle, is that we registered the trademark relaxometer in probably the 70s because it was doing well commercially. It was mainly bought by clinical psychologists and then by their patients, and we went on and developed a lot of other stuff in stress management. But that was only a registered trademark. It was too easy to rip off the circuit. Anybody could have designed that.
And is that the same with the software? Because you developed software for various things.
Well, for Acorn, again, the overall market size was not big enough to justify IP protection. If anybody in the Acorn sphere had tried to reverse engineer the software and then recreate it separately, we were already there. It would not have been worth it. So there was the protection offered by a trivial market in the global IP picture, rather than any formal step at taking protection.
And it's having that lead-in time where you are actually the market leader, and it would just take time for people to catch up. And the idea then is that you move on to something else. Okay.
Nobody ever got into PC cards ever because it wasn't worth it.
Well, you mentioned with Alex knowing Hermann Hauser from quite a young age. So can you tell us a bit more about that? Did you know them socially?
He recognizes me if he meets me. We don't move in the same social circle. We might easily see each other at certain kinds of networking meeting, like Cambridge Network. But as I say, I'm backing out of those gradually. Our paths cross from time to time just by being around Cambridge, but it's a familiar social kind of connection. I haven't been to his house, he hasn't been to my house.
That's right. It was something between Alex and
he was much more closely connected. And if I wanted to approach Herman about anything now, apart from raising 100 million, I would go by way of Alex anyway.
The 2 steps of connection, in a sense, yes.
I remember reading about your 2 boys that they approached Herman Hauser and Chris Curry for work experience. Was it their own initiative, or were they encouraged by their father?
Oh, I would certainly have encouraged them because they were really interested in what was going on. They probably did it without even needing encouragement. They're that kind of guy. They go where their instinct, their feeling leads them.
Okay, I think we're sort of getting to the latter end of the other conversation. There's a few other questions that we'd like to ask you, and one of them, you've now been a serial entrepreneur for how long would you say?
43 years.
43 years.
44.
44.
Yes. Anniversary, May this year.
So now with the wisdom of experience and looking back in time, what advice would you give to your younger self now?
I think that I have been able to act by possessing the right balance of intuition and reason. Now, this is a useless answer for anybody else because they won't automatically have that same balance. But it off the cuff, and I had no warning of that question, I have made some decisions which have been errors. Not many, surprisingly few. Given, I mean, the list of products that Aleph One has sold, there must be 20. An awful lot were in the biofeedback stress management area. And a few mistakes have been made. There were also successes that we simply hadn't touched on in the 1970s, for example, where I took a raw idea, reduced it to practice, tried it out, figured out how to market it, advertise it, and it went as a product until 1980. So I want to know who's going to buy it, but that's the end. No, the whole process does revolve around who is going to buy it, and some feeling about, okay, how many of them are there? How much is it going to cost? What sort of money do they have to spend? The 1970s product I described, really, we had to quit when the process of funding for schools, secondary schools, and to a lesser extent private schools, changed to one where it was no longer administered through local government by educational authorities with education advisors. We had hung that product partly on education advisors because the originator taught education advisors. You can see what a good hook it was. But we quit that because funding methods changed. You have to know a fair amount about the market, but the other crucial thing is what's the cost of getting into it? I got into selling a kind of biofeedback instrument for electromyographic feedback by seeing it at an exhibition in the USA when I was going to the conferences regularly about it, and striking a deal with the guy who worked from home, like me, in Plymouth, Long Island. And he would ship half a dozen over to me, and I would test them and put batteries in and mark them up, and maybe do a new revision of the instruction book for the UK market, and a list of references at the back about how people had used this technology. And then I would be advertising it to by exhibitions, by some advertising, and by word of mouth and historical contacts within the field that I had been working in. So it's not random, and I've never written a business plan, and I suspect a number of the things that Aleph One has done, if they had to be formulated as a business plan, would have then fallen flat on their face, because I would have spent 6 months working on the business plan and not got back to that manufacturer in Sussex. And it's just not the way I've worked. And it has worked for me. Applying it now will be a great deal more difficult. Things are getting more formal. You now almost certainly have to have ISO 9000 and whatever it is certification. I was able to dismiss that when it reared its ugly head by saying our customers don't really care.
It's interesting, you were talking about how it was your interest and your son's enthusiasm which got them to go into that area, and their careers evolved out of that. So you're now going to have, I don't know, how old are your grandchildren now?
The youngest is 13, the oldest is 25.
All right, so if they're suddenly coming to you and they're saying, I'm not too sure what I want to do in the future or where I'm going to go, what would your advice be to them? Is it worth setting up a business? Or
well, it has to be do something you are enthusiastic about. Mm-hmm. And this places a great responsibility upon secondary school teachers and then on university level teachers. If you can't get kids enthusiastic, why should they bother to do anything? I am, of course, exaggerating, But I keep hearing of people who are giving credit to their school teachers for getting them interested in something. And I think it's extremely important. When you are in primary school, your horizon is limited by the village and the school is limited by the playground. When you go to secondary school, one, maybe both those constraints disappear, but you are still limited by the examinations, the qualification processes that circumscribe your freedom of movement. Some people escape for a gap year. Good for them. That, I think, maybe should be made obligatory. They've got to follow they've got to find an enthusiasm, and this is where teachers and parents also have to collaborate on this. Both are necessary. It's no good having an enthusiastic teacher if there are no books in the house, or the teacher thinks this girl would be really good at dance, but her parents can't for one reason or another. Goes her to all the dance practices and then all the dance performances all around the county and so on and so on. Enthusiasm and enablement, therefore, are two fundamental things. Let me just think about this in relation to specific grandchildren. Well, their careers are not fully formed, but one of my wife's grandsons is now 19. He's always been absolutely brilliant at sport. And he did business studies to A level, but at a school where he did sport 3 afternoons a week and travelled around to football matches. Soccer is his sport. But he's just good at sport. He's just got astonishing hand-eye coordination. He's a goalkeeper. He's now in upstate New York at a college where he has a scholarship and they play soccer. So he has a soccer scholarship and he plays soccer 3 afternoons a week and does training in the meantime. And he's doing business studies. Now, that's all come about. He also has a place at Loughborough University, which he might take up and might not. Actually, quite a good intersection of soccer and business studies, so sport and business studies. He's only just started last Saturday. So it's all very new, but I think it's the right thing for him to do, and so do his parents, thank goodness. And so they have a premature emptier nest. I don't know what I would have done if I had had an average or a below average child. There are so many things you can get interested in. I mean, you may not be academic, but music and drama are things that some grandchildren have got keenly interested in, and in one case pursued it as a career.
I wouldn't worry. I think you've touched on it, and the key thing really is that to be enthusiastic about a particular area, because that's what drives you. To have an interest and to develop in that. Looking at it from an environment now where technology and computing is such an integral part of our lives, one of the difficult things seems to be to find the next generation that are going to follow in that area. Do you have any particular thoughts on that?
I think even Upton should get a Nobel Prize. You know that he created the Raspberry Pi because he was director of admissions for St. John's College, and the kids presenting to him to do computer science, that was what he was director of admissions for, had never programmed and didn't know anything about it, except the occasional outstanding one who had got hooked on BBC micros when they still existed. They've gone because Acorn has gone. And Upton said, I'm going to do something about this. And he had a very good public meeting at Arm, thank goodness, and said, this is what I want to do. And he's got massive support. He's done the early stage development and proof of principle very well. It's now in massive production, and people are buying them by the million, and I could not be more pleased. It addresses the problem you described really compellingly. And part of my appreciation is due to the fact you can buy them off the peg at RS or not Maplin, the other one. And you can make them do very simple things. And there is an infrastructure growing up around, an ecosystem growing up around them, of how to do really simple experiments. And this is what we need. And I couldn't be more pleased. So that's why I see that his prize should be greater than most people's, because I think he is exploiting an enthusiasm which was very, very powerful around here for a very long time and began to fade and now has to exist outside this particular building and this particular organization. And I think he's on the right track. And I'm delighted.
Brilliant. Well, on such a passionate and positive note, I want to thank you very much, Laurie van Someren, for your time today. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for asking the right questions.